I'm here with controversial film critic and contributor to the National Review, Armond White, who was a key contributor and critic for the New York Press and the one of the contributing authors to the New York Press collection of film criticism, which we discussed here on the show a few months ago, The Press Gang. So I'm very honored to have you back to talk about your latest book, which is called Make Spielberg Great Again.
There it is.
It is a career spanning for both you and Steven Spielberg look at the works of the greatest, I think, pop icon director of our time. And I just want to kick things off by first of all asking, how are you doing?
I'm doing good, thank God. I'm okay.
All right. And also, I want to talk about how about my first experience with this book. I got a copy in the mail, and I immediately sent a picture of it to a colleague of mine, just because I was excited to read something that I wasn't expecting to have on my plate. And his reaction was, "Oh, geez, does this guy like anything Spielberg's ever done?" Now, I understand that reaction because you have a certain reputation. I don't think you disagree with that. But after having read the book, it occurs to me that the title Make Spielberg Great Again is not just a kind of a cute play on a presidential campaign slogan, but it's also the thesis of the book, in that instead of being someone who just trashes Spielberg, it's very clear throughout most of these essays and criticisms and commentary that you're a great admirer and a big fan of a lot of his work, and you talk very passionately about it. But at some point in his career, you feel that he not necessarily went astray, but something changed. And this is a 368-page exploration of the evolution of the filmmaker in trying to find out exactly what that change was, what it means for him as an artist, what it means for the audience and his critics, and possibly laying out a map for where things could go from here. I think it's a brilliant work. It's odd for me as a credentialed film critic to be saying that, you know, one of my favorite film writers now is Armond White, but I think anyone who would raise their eyebrows at that probably just has not read a lot of your work. So thank you for the opportunity to talk to you about this this book. I've got a lot of questions, so I hope you're game for it.
Well, thank you. That's beautiful to hear all of that, and I appreciate it very much. I mean, I don't write to have people agree with me, but I'm pleased when they are when they respond to what I've written, and respond in I think in an open-minded and also an enthusiastic way. I appreciate it. Let's go.
All right. So let's talk about Steven Spielberg as a filmmaker. Now, I think one of the earliest pieces in this book is Sugarland Express, his first, first film. So, and you write about him as a new filmmaker, as kind of someone to watch. You've got some enthusiasm around what he's doing in the movie there. Was Explain to me the lifelong love of Spielberg's films. What caught you about that film in particular that carried you on through the movies that really he became known for throughout his career? Was it something that you recognized in his technique, in his spirit? Was it just sort of a brand name thing? What was it that hooked you about Spielberg?
Well, with the first theatrical film, which was the Sugarland Express, I can only tell you I had an immediate response to that, and the response was enthusiastic and awed and impressed. And it started that way. It started with that first theatrical film. At some point in the book, I think it's in the Poltergeist chapter, I do refer to some of his TV work that appeared before Sugarland, such as the TV movie Something Evil. And it's not that the name Steven Spielberg meant something to me when Something Evil first showed on television, but the name stuck with me, so that when Sugarland Express came out, I could relate to the name Steven Spielberg. But it was the Sugarland Express that really did impress me the most. Just from the beginning, this was a filmmaker with which I felt I was um, emotionally and aesthetically in sync. Uh, he's, he, he was one of my guys from the beginning, and so it was it was easy to respond to and be interested in his work from that point on. Let me say something briefly about the book, though. I've been trying to in several of the past books that I have published. I've been collecting some of my writings on artists that I care about. The first one was a book on Michael Jackson called "Keep Moving: The Michael Jackson Chronicles," and that was a collection of things I had written about Michael Jackson over the years. And there's another book called New Position: The Prince Chronicles. Same thing. The Spielberg book was the same kind of venture, but it differs from the Michael Jackson and Prince books in this sense. I've been writing about Spielberg longer, and though I was following that Chronicles idea with Spielberg here, uh, the difference is that I've been writing about him longer, it occurred to me as I was putting the book together that my development as a film watcher and film writer was kind of simultaneous with his development as a filmmaker. May I say that in a sense we started together. He started in theatrical films, and I started writing film criticism right about the same time. So from that first article about the Sugarland Express onward, the book kind of captures my development as a film critic as well as my response to his development as a filmmaker. And I felt connected, if that's the right term. I felt connected to him from the beginning.
I'm curious because these reviews go back decades, as does Spielberg's, work, obviously. In putting this book together, did you go back and reread everything? And if you did, do you notice a marked change in your response to certain movies? Like, do you look at Sugarland Express or The Color Purple the same way that you do in 2020 as you did in 1973 or 1985?
There is only one exception. My feelings about those films have remained the same. The ones about which I had initial enthusiasm, that enthusiasm has only grown. Uh, there's only one exception, and that exception is 1941. But my response to those films, my thinking about those films has not changed, but I am more impressed with them over the years. When I've revisited them, they they strike me as the works of someone who was born to make movies and who understood composition, who understood visual rhythm, who understood the human condition in a way that I could respond to, the social conditions in ways that I recognized and could also respond to positively. And that has all remained the same. The Sugarland Express was, you could say it's part of that Lovers on the Lamb genre that made a cultural impact with Bonnie and Clyde in 1967. And it follows the same, some of the same, that same genre the same way as Robert Altman's Thieves Like Us, as Terrence Malick's Badlands, and other Lovers on the Lamb films. But Spielberg's is different in the sense that it has a different kind of cinematic idea. It's the first one. It's the only one of that Lovers on the Lamb genre that I think is also widescreen, which is also an indication of Spielberg's visual sense of his aesthetic that I responded to, his gift for widescreen composition, also his interest in the kinetics of cinema, in the kinetics of the chase movie format, and also his interest in popular culture and his sense of humor. Those things are apparent in the very first theatrical release of his, and those are things that I respond to in cinema, and especially in American cinema, and felt that this is a soul, and this is a vision that I am interested in, and it's been an adventure watching it develop over the years.
Something else that I noticed reading this now, from what I know of you, is it fair to say that you are, conservative in your political leanings?
I am I am a label resistor in my political leanings.
Okay.
How's that?
No, I mean that's totally fine. I think that it would be fair to say that people might view you as a conservative, and that's not a judgment or a criticism on my part. It's sort of the setup for this question, something that struck me. Um, as I mentioned before, you've got, a certain reputation, and I don't think anyone can read this book and still come away with that assessment, especially when it comes to your writing on The Color Purple from 1985, which shows, to use that kind of a weird modern term, a degree of wokeness or appreciation for diversity 3 decades before it became, before it really made its way into the public consciousness, talking about this being a significant Black drama, the best, film about, I think, I don't want to misquote here, but something about the best gay movie that Hollywood had produced, for several, years afterwards. So when you think of someone having a particularly, stodgy or conservative point of view, to read the richness and the empathy with which you write about, these characters, it's really surprising to me. When you were writing about this in 1985, I know people had still this idea of Spielberg as being, kind of popcorn, kid stuff, and this was a first real foray into drama, and people weren't taking him that, seriously. Did you have any qualms about writing so, intellectually and movingly about this sort of pop artist making his way into the realm of the high art?
No, no, because when Sugarland Express came out in 1974, it was part of a what I consider a movement among American filmmakers that I refer to as the American Renaissance. That was that 70s period when filmmakers of a certain generation, in response to the French New Wave and European art cinema of the 60s, found new ways of exploring American experience and new ways of exploring American genre, American film genre. And so the kinds of films that Spielberg made, that Scorsese was making, that Altman was making, that Coppola was making, these were films with a new vision of America, a new kind of political consciousness, as well as a changed aesthetic consciousness as well. And so these filmmakers made movies that I think required or asked audiences to think about America in a more challenging fashion, and to think about their own personal experiences, social experiences in a more challenging fashion. When the Sugarland Express came out, when The Color Purple came out, uh, these were not radical films. These were films, these were typical 70s Hollywood American Renaissance movies that were full of a new political energy as well as a new artistic impetus. And it was disappointing to me that some so-called intellectual critics could not see that and respond to that in The Color Purple. Their failing was indeed a failing. I think it was easier for them to consign The Color Purple to sappiness and to a kind of faux Walt Disney fantasy film, rather than to deal with the racial issues, the sexual issues, and the social issues that made it a rich film. And I felt that there was nothing I could do except try to explain in my writing why this was an important work, why Spielberg was a serious artist, not simply the man who made the blockbuster Jaws, but a man who understood something about the complexity of the American human experience. And I feel it's all there. I let me apologize for giving you a glib answer before when you asked about being a conservative, being labeled a conservative. Um, I don't like the labels, but the truth is that um, liberalism has changed, the world has changed, as Spielberg has changed, as I have changed. And yes, in those writings from 1985 on about The Color Purple, there is a particular political perspective that is apparent in it. The first of those articles appeared in a newspaper called the City Sun, which is a Black-owned newspaper here in New York City, and a paper that I guess in its politics one could call it progressive, I guess, but it was certainly a pro-Black newspaper, and it was interested in all the things in politics and culture that related to the lives of Black Americans. And I, as the arts editor there, was committed to trying to present to the readership works of art that improved the lives of Black Americans, and interested also in ferreting out those works of art that were dishonest and unhelpful to Black American lives. But also, of course, this includes white Americans as well. It was a Black-owned newspaper, but it wasn't a newspaper for only a Black audience. It was a newspaper for people who were intelligent. And it was not a racially limited newspaper, and it wasn't even in the staff of that paper. So I wrote from that perspective. But like I say, what was liberal in 1985 has changed. It's quite different from what's considered liberal here in 2020. And so there's no point in I don't like the label. There's no point in responding to a label or pinning a label on myself. I'm just writing as I see it. And it's more important, I think, to deal with works of art as they come about. It's more important to try to understand these movies and also understand my own responses to the world rather than to accept a label about them. If that helps to clarify something, I hope so. And it goes to, I think, the basic trajectory of the book, the kind of liberalism that Spielberg espoused in films like The Color Purple is different from the kinds of political attitudes that one sees in his later films. So there's a change in me, there's a change in him, there's been a change in the world politically.
And one of the things that struck me, and I can't recall if this is actually spelled out in your later reviews, because there are certain films of his filmography that keep popping up thematically throughout the decades in your writing. Color Purple is one of them. Amistad is certainly another. But it struck me that in 1985, it was interesting that a white Jewish director would take on a beloved African American novel and turn that into a big major release. I don't know if that would even be, instead of interesting in 2020, I feel like it would be called problematic, and only someone with Spielberg's cachet might be able to get away with it without calls for massive cancellation. Right. What, and this is something that you sort of write about in the book, Spielberg's his upbringing and his heritage, the kind of the parallels with Jewish heritage to Black heritage that also kind of comes back up in your writings about Amistad. Was that something that you had to think about after you watched The Color Purple? Is this something you ruminated on, or was it just an instant connection where you recognized that watching the movie and then watching some of his other works that you started to draw these connections?
Well, the world has changed, and in 1985 and the world that I grew up in, it was considered proper and expected for people of different ethnic groups to feel compassion for each other's experiences, to relate to each other's experiences. And this is what it means to be America. This is part of the e pluribus unum idea of the United States of America. And in the best Hollywood movies throughout the history of Hollywood, there were filmmakers who worked towards that kind of understanding all the time. I recall specifically, Color Purple came out in '85. I recall specifically in 1974 when Martin Ritt made Sounder, and I remember reading an interview with Martin Ritt, and he was asked in '74, why is it that you chose to make a movie about a family of Black sharecroppers in the 1930s? And he said, because in my Jewish experience, I related to it. And that was sufficient. That answer probably would not be considered sufficient today. Because of the unfortunate changes in society and culture, there are people who are willing to jump on that and condemn it and say it's improper. But my view of the world, that's what that's how human beings are supposed to think and behave. And most importantly, I think that's what art is for. Art is to help us to understand human experience, primarily by witnessing the experiences of others, not simply experiences of people who look like us, to use that horrible cliche, but simply the experience of other human beings. And that's what great art can do. It can make you understand what it is like to be someone else. It can make you understand how someone else is like you. And that's what a great movie can do. I think that's what The Color Purple does. In my writings on The Color Purple, I make references to John Ford movies, Douglas Sirk movies, and in the history of American popular culture, you didn't have to look just like Lana Turner or John Wayne to relate to those films. You related to those films because as we used to be educated, that's how you respond to art. And this is what Hollywood used to be good at until recently.
Yeah, it's reading about your Color Purple, your perspective on that film. I think I watched that film at way too young an age. I was 8, I believe, when it came out, and my dad made a point of taking me and my mom to the films at the theater. I'm a mixed race kid. My mom is white. My dad was black, and it was never really a conversation about the idea of someone who is not from that world, that ethnic experience. They couldn't possibly understand what it's like, to be, in my body and to make a film that represents me. There was none of that. And I feel like there's a lot more of that conversation today, which is, kind of distressing in a lot of ways, which I think in your later writings, you're starting to touch on that idea towards the end of the book, but we'll get to that in a little bit. But yeah, that's just sort of a personal anecdote to say that you really got me thinking about the attitudes that, I'm sort of saturated in today in the modern pop culture and also the writings and thinking about, greater art versus what I grew up with. And, a lot of things just don't seem to make a lot of sense anymore.
Yeah, that the change that's happened is unfortunate, but it's it's how I was raised, it's how I was educated also. I don't want to get off to a different discussion, but I've talked with some friends who grew up in New York of my generation, and they seem to have had a different education than I did. When I was going to school, we read classic literature, but we also read Black literature. I've been informed by some New Yorkers of my generation that in public school they were not taught any Black literature whatsoever. Perhaps it's a good fortune of my growing up in a town like Detroit, Michigan, that the education system was different in that sense. We had to read William Faulkner, we had to read Richard Wright. We read them both. And why do we read them both? Because they're American artists. And this is part of the American experience, is part of American culture. And we are supposed to relate to all of it, and we can relate to all of it. And when Hollywood was good, it worked on it operated on those principles, that same principle. And I insist that this is the best way for a culture to be understood and enjoyed.
No disagreements there. I want to jump ahead a bit to the movie Always from 1989. If I recall correctly, the writing about that in the book is not an archival piece. It's new. Is that right?
Yes, it is a new piece on Always.
Okay. So did you not review it at the time, or was there a reason that you decided not to include it in the book? It jumped out at me as like, oh, this is not from, there's not a date stamp on it.
Right. The City Sun archives are incomplete, which is to say my own archives are incomplete. couldn't find it. I couldn't find the original review. I had written about it. I know I wrote about it, but I cannot commit it to memory. But so I thought I wanted to be as complete about Spielberg here as I could. So I thought it was necessary to cover it and to write about it as best I could from this perspective. But that's another example of what you asked me about before. My attitude about Always has not changed. I was stunned by it back in 1989, and I looked at it again, and I'm still amazed by it. In some ways, I think it's Spielberg's most visually beautiful film, photographed by Mikhail Salomon, and so it was a pleasure to dive back into it again, and try to explain what I like about it today, and what I remember loving about it when it first came out.
In that case, did you write from memory, or did you rewatch the film and then just kind of try and put yourself back into the spot where you were in '89 when you were writing about it, picking up on some of the same themes?
Oh, you want to know about my process? Okay.
Well, not necessarily the entire thing. I'm just curious about this one case where there was a gap in the archive, so you wanted to write a new piece, but did you refamiliarize yourself with the film, or is it a case where you knew it like the back of your hand and how you felt about it, so you could just kind of bang it out?
Well, the process always changes with each film. In this case, the process was interesting because I started to write about it from memory. And I thought I want to be as fair to it as possible. So, Armond, you better look at it again. So I did watch it again, but I watched it again after writing a first draft. And then I wrote a second draft after watching it again. But that's one of those movies where I don't think I really needed to, but I wanted to be better on it this time around, all these years later. But I have a pretty good memory of films I like. I tend to try to put out of my memory films I don't like, but I have a pretty good memory of Always, and so it was fun to write about again, and to almost write about it from scratch, so to speak.
Well, that's something that struck me about your writing is the sense of memory. Uh, Not only, or I should say, the broad sense of your, I'll call it a pop awareness. There's references to all different kinds of films throughout the history of the art form, references to great books and probably poetry, and you just seem to have this insane breadth of knowledge that you bring to reviewing these, Hollywood blockbusters. I don't know that there's that much depth and insight in a lot of criticism today, possibly because it just feels like it's meant to be generated, on a daily thing instead of sitting with something, writing drafts per se, and putting it out into the world. What was your sort of your training like in terms of film criticism, and how did you naturally just incorporate all of the references, taking in everything you've ever seen, and then finding the right moments to interject that into your work? And is there something about Steven Spielberg's films in particular that inspire you to draw on that, decades of pop knowledge?
Well, my training comes from reading, and I guess what I know about film criticism, or what I know to be possible in the field of film criticism, comes from what I read, from the examples I've read, which would be primarily Pauline Kael and Andrew Sarris, and John Simon, and several others, and also music critics, when pop music criticism used to be good, and also literary criticism. I'm a big fan of Malcolm Cowley because I'm a big fan of Faulkner. And so my training comes from there, but it also comes from my education. And so I grew up in Detroit, Michigan. I grew up in Motown, and the two art forms that mean the most to me are movies and pop music. And I guess it's just a personal thing. One always bleeds into the other. I listen to music and I think about movies. I watch movies and I think about music. That's the way my mind works. But also in the way I was educated, that's the way my education worked. Um, I was educated I went to schools that taught about a kind of pluralistic idea about culture, that one should know about art, music, literature, many things, and one should bring them all together in your experience. Uh, for me, one of my most formative experiences was in humanities class that I took in college as an undergraduate. And I had a great instructor at Wayne State University, and she believed that all the arts could be related to each other. And she taught the humanities class that way. You know, we listened to music, we read literature, we looked at movies, uh, and she could bring it all together. And that made a huge impression on me. And I felt this is the way I think. This is the way I live my cultural life. And why not? Why not? It's how I get pleasure from culture. Another influence on me was the French New Wave, and how the critics from the Cahiers du Cinema, who became the filmmakers of the French New Wave, also I think had a pluralistic idea about pop culture. How they could how, for instance, in Jacques Demy's Lola, how he combine his enthusiasm for Sternberg and Ophuls with Beethoven. And surely this is how a 21st century educated person thinks and feels. And it's natural. It felt natural. It felt natural to see it exhibited in French New Wave films. It felt natural to read it in certain pop culture criticism written by others. And it's the way I respond to it. And so I have to do that in my writing because it's how my mind works, and it's how I experience art.
Now,
And you know, and like I said or alluded to in talking about The Color Purple, Spielberg could have told that story just from the point of view of that Alice Walker uses in her novel, from Celie's point of view, the point of view of a young black woman. But instead, he makes very conscious and obvious references to John Ford and Douglas Sirk. And because he, coming after the French New Wave, Spielberg, being a modernist filmmaker rather than a classical filmmaker, is conscious of different eras in art. He's conscious of the art experience and is not shy about making reference to it because that's how people of the modernist era think.
and that is one parallel that I definitely see between you and Spielberg, because he brings a lot of the history of art to bear, and even in some of the cases that you've criticized, his own art, constant references to Jaws and things popping up here and there in his films. But the other similarity that I've seen or I've noticed is this idea of being misunderstood within your own art form. I talked a little bit earlier about how, especially earlier on, before now he's known more, I think, as a quote unquote serious, Oscar grabbing filmmaker. Whereas before he was making entertainment that was for the family, but operated on levels that were several layers deeper than you might think. It's not just about a kid riding a bicycle across the moon with an alien. It's not just about a giant killer shark. There's more going on there. And I think similarly, from what I have known about you and your reputation before I even started reading you, I had heard, oh, you're the guy who likes to ruin, the tomato meter and and all of that stuff. But I feel like you are greatly misunderstood, largely by people who, maybe this is effect of the modern culture, maybe it goes back longer than I'm thinking. Folks who look at headlines or they look at what other people are saying and misinterpret the work without actually having experienced it.
Yeah, that seems to be the case. I would also wager that people have have been educated differently than I was. People tend to be miseducated these days, so they have closed-minded attitudes about it. Also, unfortunately, I think a lot of folks these days don't know what criticism is because it's practiced so poorly in most media, and I think ideas about how a critic should approach a movie is misunderstood. I think a lot of people believe that a critic's job is to promote whatever is new rather than try to explore whatever is new. And they simply don't understand it. And I think this problem has been exacerbated by Rotten Tomatoes, which has encouraged the kind of herd mentality that juvenile mentality that it's best to go along with the crowd rather than to have one's individual response. Um, I walk in my own shoes. I sit in my movie theater seat. I sit in my own seat. I can't sit in anybody else's seat. I have to look at things from my own perspective, and that's true of everyone. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of people don't understand that that's how it works.
And I think that's something else that comes across in the writing, because you do spend a lot of, like I mentioned, the book praising Spielberg with some light critiques here and there, some very interesting perspectives, especially when it comes to the, almost universally beloved Schindler's List, which I think you appreciate as a piece of art, but also find very troubling in terms of what it represents. But I guess the idea of the troll film critic, I feel like it's kind of a myth. The idea that there are people who are going to sit and write 1,000 to 2,000 words or a series of essays about a film that they, hate. I just don't know that that happens. And anyone, again, who can read this book and come away thinking that you are a troll, I can't quite understand that. It's very clear that you care about what you're writing about. You care about the subject matter, and you also have ideas that sort of contribute to a through line, a narrative arc. You might not have been conscious of it in 1973 or 1985 or in 89. We were writing about Last Crusade, but by snowballing your thoughts on Spielberg throughout the years, you are coming up with a definite story, one that's open to interpretation. But this isn't the work of a careless person who's just interested in getting clicks, I don't think.
Well, thank you, thank you. I go back to the fact that there are very few examples of criticism out there for people to go by.
Like good criticism. I say criticism. There's criticism everywhere, but
good criticism, or what I would like to call real criticism. Mm. Oh, I don't want to get into the Roger Ebert thing. Well, but I think he destroyed people's perception of what criticism could be, largely through the idea that that promoting films and liking films, that's a critic's mission. The mission is not to like films. I think the mission is to try to understand what you saw and to try to explain what you saw in a way that's fair and that makes sense, but also at the same time to express oneself. And it's not a matter of promoting new work. It's a matter of or promoting work just because it's new. It's a matter of trying to understand the film, and also for me personally, trying to understand my own responses to it. People on the internet like to say that I just want attention, but that strikes me as being a very juvenile perspective. It's I've been fortunate that I've been writing about film and culture for a long time, so in a sense. And I've always had for all those years, most of those years, I was aligned with a publication. So the publications had the attention. I didn't need to try to get attention. The publications I worked for already had it. My obligation was to try to respect the intelligence of the people who hired me and of the people I wanted to read me. And it's not about, I'm not after attention. I want to be read, period. I don't say things just to produce hot takes, because I take criticism seriously. I don't believe that the 140 character idea of criticism or the thumbs up idea of criticism is at all sufficient. I take it seriously.
Um, have you, and this is sort of tangential, but have you ever read or heard any criticisms of you or your criticism that you've taken to heart and thought maybe there's a point there? Or do you feel like everyone's just kind of off base in general?
Uh, well, self praise stinks. But
I'm not looking for self-praise. I'm just trying to see if there's any of the arrows that have been shot at you over the decades have landed, or have you just deflected all of them as just noise?
well, I'm only human, and I don't think I'm perfect, and so I'm always trying to write better. I'm always trying to think better, and and on occasion, I well I always try to think better. I always try to write better. So I always question whatever writing I have produced, and I always hope that it's good enough. I always hope that it's thoughtful enough. But at the same time, I've been doing it for a while, and I've had some experience in it myself, and I've also had experience in reading others, and I can tell a fraudulent film critic from a real one. And when the personal criticism comes from a fraudulent point of view, I can dismiss it. Thank God, because I know that this person doesn't know what they're talking about. And not to be arrogant, but I'll quote Morrissey. He said at one point, he said, every criticism that has been leveled at me, I thought about it first. And I understood when he said that, because in writing, I'm not just blurting things out. I think about what impact might this have, and in that way I try to avoid saying stupid things, and I certainly try to avoid saying things that I cannot defend. Whatever I am fortunate enough to print in public is what I feel that I can defend, so that when criticism comes my way, I think this person has not thought it through as well as I have. I dismiss what they have to say, because it's not worthy of being considered.
Well, I got to say, you write very persuasively. I'm going to confess something here. Close Encounters of the Third Kind, a film that I watched a few years ago. They had some big anniversary screenings, and I went with a friend of mine. And my dad loved that movie growing up. And I don't know that I'd watched it all the way through, because, to a little kid, 3 hours, whatever, is an eternity. But I saw it in the theater, and I just didn't get it. But after having read the way that you write about Close Encounters, I feel like I need to go back and reevaluate it and perhaps get into a different headspace. I don't know if it was just the night that I saw it or the hype or whatever, but I feel like you describe the movie that I saw, but in a way that I was not able to watch it at the time. I think that's sort of true there's a number of movies in the book, I'm sad to say, that I have not actually seen. I missed Amistad, but after having read it, even though you talk in great depth about what what goes on in the film and the themes, you sell it really well, to the point where I don't care if I know the arc of the story. I want to go check out this movie to experience firsthand the aesthetics, the themes, the performances. So yeah, I guess thank you for for making me doubt myself, and also for giving me some new avenues to explore now that I've finished the book.
Well, thank you, and you are welcome, and you are also you are invited to experience these films for yourself, actually. And I hope for you that you will be able to experience them on the big screen, because I think that's what they were made for, and that's the best way to experience them. And there's nothing like it. And certainly a large part of my enthusiasm for Close Encounters has to do with first seeing it on a big screen where it's bigger than you. And it's in spatial terms, it is overwhelming, but it's also overwhelming emotionally and in terms of its ideas. And I'm convinced that you can't fully get that from television. You need one needs the theatrical experience, and that's the kind of artist that Spielberg is. It's the kind of artist the French New Wave were. They made movies to be seen in theaters, and that's the best way, I think, to understand them. I believe it's possible to miss things on television just because the image is smaller, and that visceral experience of watching something large in front of you is important to cinema as an art form. It's also why so often I think of Spielberg in the same way that I think of D.W. Griffith, because like Griffith, he understood that the large screen format creates a new kind of art, and it has to be seen. It has to be seen that way to be fully appreciated.
I want to ask you about Griffith because he's another name that pops up, I think, almost more than any other in the book, as an influence and also as someone that you greatly respect as a filmmaker. Now, I have not seen any of D.W. Griffith's films. In fact, it's fair to say, again, confessing things here, I only knew him from Birth of a Nation, which, again, I have not watched. So I think the popular conception of Griffith is as a racist filmmaker. And you mentioned that which award they stripped stripped his name away back in the late 90s from some prestigious award because of controversy. Directors Guild. Okay, that's right, the D.W. Griffith Award. So it sounds like you've seen the breadth of his filmography, and that isn't necessarily getting off the point, but I wanted to ask, do you consider him to be a quote unquote racist filmmaker, or do you just see him as a talented filmmaker whose technique you admire? And what does that say about Spielberg's, if anything, his drawing on Griffith as an inspiration for his films?
Well, I suppose Griffith was racist, but aren't we all? So if one wants to throw that accusation at Griffith, one should also be willing to accept it in oneself, because we all sin and fall short of the glory of God, and we all have to try to improve ourselves. And so Griffith is who he was, and he made movies to express himself honestly, and then he worked to improve himself. Right after The Birth of a Nation, he made Intolerance. And Intolerance is in many ways an apology for what's wrong with The Birth of a Nation, with his attitudes, with the racist attitudes in Birth of a Nation. And so he attempted to correct them in the way an artist should, by making another work of art that improves on the past work of art. And you really need to see those movies, Ian. You need to see them because they're great works of art, and they're great experiences, and they teach you things. They teach me things, and they need to be seen, so that you, if for no other reason, to have your own response, and to have a certain response to them, and not leave it up to the opinion of others, but also you give yourself the pleasure of those great works of art. We're all racist, and we all have to work against that, and also work not to be cruel, or as Griffith would say, not to be intolerant of others. That's what it means to be human. It used to be what it means to be an American. And Spielberg's no different, though coming many years and generations after Griffith, we all have racist attitudes. We all have racist knee-jerk responses to things and people. But we have to think and feel beyond that. That's just part of the struggle of being human beings. And it's also the struggle that every artist has to contend with, that every good artist has to make. to try to express themselves honestly and express themselves in a way that respects and considers the experiences of others as well, but mainly expressing themselves honestly, so that so that they make their feelings clear, and we can find our own space, our own selves in what they are showing us and telling us. And Spielberg does it in his way. Spielberg does it in The Color Purple the same way Martin Ritt did it in Sounder. And we work past the racism that we reflexively experience or exhibit. We work past that. That's, that's all you can do, and that's all you can ask of anyone else.
Well, and I hadn't. I don't think I was aware of the intolerance piece to it coming after Birth of a Nation. We certainly don't hear about that in the modern discourse when Griffith is brought up at all. It's always that kind of landmark piece. But now that you mention it, Spielberg seems to have, at least in your estimation, and I share the opinion, although I haven't watched the films in a while, made that his own sort of apologia with the Indiana Jones trilogy, with Raiders and with Temple of Doom having some very troubling attitudes about Western imperialism, and then sort of coming full circle in The Last Crusade, trying to make a narrative corrective without hitting the audience over the head with it.
Right. That's what a serious artist would do, rather than grind out the same kind of movie over and over again. To reinvestigate those ideas and to try to expand them and go beyond them. And I think Spielberg does that. He does that throughout the Indiana Jones series, and as part of his development as a popular artist. He responds, I think, to the ideas that he worked with in previous films, and also I imagine he responds to the audience response. It was one great experience in film culture was during the 1980s, to see how other people responded to the Indiana Jones series. I recall how you could walk past movie theaters and see people lined up to get into the next Indiana Jones film. And there were 3 of them in the 80s, and there were lines in front of theaters for each one of those 3 films, which said to me that these movies, that people respond to these movies, they relate to these movies, and they also expect something of these movies. And it's the expectation of the popular audience that I think also connects Spielberg to Griffith. They knew they had a popular audience, but they also knew that this audience deserved the best that they could offer, which is why Griffith's films get better and better as he makes them, and Spielberg's seem to as well, because he's responding to, he respects his audience, and he's giving them as good as he could give every time out.
Now, would you say that's true still today? I know that because the book is divided into 4 sections. I think was it America in relation to the world, after The Color Purple, 9/11, and then Obama, which pretty much brings us up. His output in the Trump era has not been, much, partially because of this whole year as a wash, right? But because I know he's got West Side Story that's in post-production, which is kind of a weird movie to think about. But I think I guess my question is, your critiques really start coming in the Obama chapter, and I guess with the Obama era, suggesting a heavily leaning Spielberg leaning very heavily into overtly left politics, which he may have still believed in back in his earlier work, but just was more subtle about, more of a humanist approach to things. So do you still regard him as a quality filmmaker? It's just that you disagree with his politics, or is there something consistent, or is there an inconsistency in terms of his output that you're finding? Is he still at the top of his game, or is your assessment of his political ideology taking over the movies he's making? Is that affecting the quality of the films themselves?
Sure. The quality of the films has changed. That's why the book is titled "Make Spielberg Great Again." He's lost his former greatness, and what is that? What was that greatness? I think that greatness was an understanding of, it's the Griffith understanding of the popular audience and the broad American experience, and the understanding that this is a country and a world made of distinct individuals and distinct experiences, and that nobody needs to be judged, they just need to be understood. And that always seemed to be one of the beauties of Spielberg's movies. That every time out, he seemed to make a movie that showed an understanding of that reality. And things changed, and the change I think started with the trauma of 9/11, shook things up. But yet after 9/11, he made two of his most powerful films, I believe, which are Munich and The War of the Worlds. And then another change happened, and that change is represented by Obama. And that's a deep issue, because I think it is what happened with Obama was a kind of a misunderstanding of what used to be American virtues, and a manipulation of people's attitudes about politics, and a manipulation of people's understanding of what made America great, and also a manipulation of a change in notions of what it means to be liberal. And I think those changes affected a lot of people, and Spielberg was not immune to those changes. And they are evident in the works that he made after Obama came on the scene. And coincidentally, when Obama came on the scene, Spielberg's filmmaking went down in quality, went down in understanding and appreciation of the plurality of American experience. And to me, it's just plain evident if one is open enough to see it. The films are not as rich as they used to be. The political perspective has narrowed. Think about it. In films like War of the Worlds, even going all the way back to the beginning with the Sugarland Express, the heroic figures in those movies are what we could label conservative people, conservative men. Captain Tanner in the Sugarland Express, the Tom Cruise character in War of the Worlds. Spielberg has no compunction about identifying with those figures and showing their humanity. Now, after Obama, the presentation of character becomes more judgmental, as if to only ascribe heroism to people who express liberal ideology. And that's a narrowing of his artistic vision. It's a narrowing of his point of view, which then, of course, constricts his artistic vision. And that's terrible. That's terribly unfortunate. One of the beauties, the greatness of Munich is, even though Spielberg is obviously, pro-Israel, a pro-Israel Jewish American, he understands the different points of view. He understands the tragedy of murder, no matter who commits it. And that understanding is not apparent in Bridge of Spies. It's just gone. The point of view is narrowed. And it constricted during the Obama era. And a film like his Obama promotional video kind of tells you the reason why. You don't even have to ask.
You know, when you wrote about that, I think I had forgotten that was even a thing. I haven't looked it up to watch it yet, but after reading about it, I'm fascinated, but I also don't really want to see it. Because it just did seem really fawning and self-aware in ways that might be ironic, particularly for critics of Obama, of which I'm certainly one.
Well, let me add something to that, by the way. So before when we touched on Griffiths being racist, I had a for a long time I had a favorite quote by the musician David Byrne. I remember when David Byrne, when the Talking Heads broke up and he was embarking on his solo career, he had a new album coming out. I think it might have been the Ray Momo album, and I remember getting a press release from Warner Brothers Records, and the press release had a prepared Q&A with David Byrne. And the last question is, what's your next project? And he said, my next project is, I am struggling to get rid of the racism instilled in me by society. I am struggling to get rid of the racism instilled in me by society. And I thought, I get it, that's fair. And I think everybody should realize that and make the same struggle. And so there are things that are instilled in us in society that we have to work to improve and to get over. And I think Spielberg is, he has ideas that are instilled in him as well, that now have reached a point where he has to try to get over the kind of political ideas that have become status quo ever since 2008.
Yeah, I mean, I understand the inherent or the instilled racism idea. I just have a problem with the idea that everybody needs to be held to account equally. There are some folks who I think perhaps are more enlightened and can see past that, and to call them, racist or imply that they have this bias that affects their relationship to other people in any significant way is just this weird way of blanketing guilt on an entire society rather than dealing with people on an individual level.
Yes, that's not that's good. It's bad. It's wrong. It's not helpful. And also to tie up the David Byrne quote is that I wrote recently about the collaboration between David Byrne and Spike Lee, which I thought was a very unfortunate piece of work. And part of what was disappointing about it is that before this, David Byrne seemed to be above obvious politics. That being an art geek, he was interested in larger issues such as human instinct and personality and irony and those things, not just blatant politics. And even though I think there is certainly spiritual components to Spielberg's work and his understanding, of course, he was never so blatant about politics as he was after 2008. And that's also, I think, a lessening and a constriction on his artistry. The politics are so obvious in his films now that they are lesser films. It's possible, I think, that one could look at War of the Worlds, one could look at The Color Purple, and not even think politically, just respond to them emotionally. But in these last few Obama era films that Spielberg has made, they're all blatantly political, and they're not even as aesthetically impressive as his previous films were. Lincoln, my God, Lincoln. I'm quoting someone here, but someone said, I heard someone say, why is it so gloomy? Why is it so dark? I mean, if it's a story about Abraham Lincoln, why isn't it bright? Why isn't it optimistic? Why is it an inspiring vision? Why is it dark? Why is it gloomy? Something went wrong. Something went wrong after 2008 in Spielberg's vision.
Now, not that you can get inside his head, but personally, do you feel that this is a genuine change in his politics, or was he, Spielberg, as an artist, trying to chase a popular trend, a mood, I guess, because Obama was such a popular, at least initially uniting figure, that to come up with films that leaned more heavily into those politics would just be seen as a smart business move, if nothing else.
Well, I think there's more to it than that. I think it gets into the problem of collaboration. I think Munich is is one of his strongest films, as I said before. And Munich was exciting because it was a collaboration with the playwright Tony Kushner. And Tony Kushner is an avowed communist. And Tony Kushner has a communist view of the world, and particularly of America. This was not a problem in Munich, where Tony Kushner could exercise his complex and indeed intelligent view of world politics, and particularly of the Jewish experience. And Spielberg, that helped Spielberg a great deal in Munich. But then they collaborated on Lincoln, and it went sour from that point, because there's a deterministic communist view of American history that is apparent in Lincoln, and it did not do a favor for Spielberg's humanism. The word I used frequently before, it constricted it, and it narrowed it, and in aesthetic terms, it darkened it. And so the collaboration with Tony Kushner, I think, is largely to blame with the change, I think the evident change in Spielberg's thinking. And terribly unfortunate, but it's all I think a result of the hypnosis of the Obama era, where a communist view of America took hold in the United States and became popularized by Obama and his supporters. And I'm afraid that Spielberg is part of that. He fell for that too, and it's apparent in the films.
Have you ever met Steven Spielberg?
I've met him on several public occasions, and they've always been wonderful and positive and welcoming on both our parts. I was always thrilled to meet him, and he seemed to express the same enthusiasm.
Well, because that was going to be my follow-up, was is he familiar with your work, and do you know if he's read any of your stuff, say post 9/11, post Obama?
That's a good question. I last met him at the New York Film Critics Dinner the year that Lincoln won a couple of prizes, and after the end of the ceremony, I just went to congratulate him, largely based on the goodwill that he had earned before. And he was surrounded by a group of people who, he's surrounded by a group of people because everybody wants to talk to Spielberg. And at one point he saw me and he said, oh, let me say hello to Armond. That was nice. And we exchanged pleasantries, and that's it. We've never had an in-depth conversation. So that was, what year was that? Would that be
2012?
12, okay, yeah.
Yeah, I talked about Lincoln on the podcast a few weeks ago, on the eve of the 2020 presidential election, and I got to say, my take on it was a lot more positive. But again, as I'd mentioned in context of some other reviews, reading your perspective on it, I don't necessarily agree or disagree, but you planted some seeds that made me think I need to go back and pay closer attention to some of the details and the thematic elements that are at play here. Because again, regardless of where people might come down on you, you are very persuasive in your argumentations.
Well, I try to be. I try to write a point of view that's worth reading. And that means writing something that's strongly stated. There's just no point in being wishy-washy in criticism. You take a stand and try to explain yourself well, and try to make good points. And gosh, I wish more people understood what criticism could be. We need to make criticism great again as well. It's like, enough of the thumbs.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that's a as good a place to any to leave it. That's a perfect note. So Armond White, again, thank you very much for talking to me about Make Spielberg Great Again. It's really a fantastic book. Again, I think, to use a cliche, an undiscovered gem. I mean, I know it just came out, but I think people really need to go and read it, not just to get a different take on you, but also a different perspective on Steven Spielberg, but also just to experience what really great, bold, and challenging film criticism can look like. Because I feel like we're in an era where it's just not. It's not as plentiful as as it perhaps used to be in the earlier days of like yourself and Kale and Saris and et cetera.
Sure. Well, Ian, I really appreciate it. I'm just so happy that you enjoyed the book.
All right, man. Well,
and I appreciate the time you've given me. Thank you.
all right. I appreciate you taking the time to talk with me, and yeah, take care, man.
All right, you too.
All right, bye.